All right, well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the quarterly meeting of the Florida Oyster Recovery Science Community of Practice. It's great to see everybody. It's been, several months since we met, and we have an exciting agenda ahead. We have a few guest speakers with us today, and some time for Q&A. We will also probably have some time if folks have updates on their research or projects in Florida focused on oysters, job opportunities, that kind of thing. Happy to spend some time at the end letting you all provide those updates as well. And so for those who are new, my name is Katie Conchar. I'm with the Nature Conservancy and coordinating the Florida Oyster Recovery Science or FORS team. Today, we have Bryan DeAngelis with us from the Nature Conservancy as well. He's a marine habitat scientist, and he and his colleague, Elliot Hall, who's with Bain and Company, have recently completed a series of work. Many of you may have been interviewed through that process, but they're here today to present on the business of oyster restoration. So we're happy to have them. There's a few papers, one white paper, one publication that I sent out for the invitation. So hopefully if folks haven't received those, we'll get those sent around again, provide some links. But with that, Bryan and Elliot, thank you so much for being here today. We are recording, but if folks have questions as we go through, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the chat. And I'll leave it then to you, Bryan. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Thanks everybody for being here. Let me just figure out how to get my slides up. Okay. You guys see that in presentation mode?
Yes, looks great.
Cool. Thank you. So yeah, thanks for joining. Like Katie said, my name is Bryan DeAngelis. I'm a marine scientist with the Nature Conservancy. I've been with TNC since 2013. I've worked primarily in coastal habitat restoration for about 20 years now. And I'll be leading you through the slides today, but I wanted to take a moment to let Elliot introduce himself, as he really did the lion's share of the work on this study. Elliot, are you able to come off mute and introduce yourself?
Yes, I can. Hi, everyone. I'm Elliot. I was working with Bryan on this project. I guess we started it in the beginning of 2022 and closed the research phase around August of 2022. I work with Bain and Company, which is a management consulting firm with a partnership with the Nature Conservancy. And really, I'm involved in lots of different work. This was my first time looking at oysters. Right now, I'm on a project working with the Special Olympics and helping them with their strategy. So I'm by no means an oyster expert, but trying to use a business lens to support lots of different types of companies. I've worked with gold mines, I've worked with oysters, I've worked with the Special Olympics, I've worked with big banks. So lots of different experiences, but using the same, I guess, analysis and techniques. It's great to meet all of you.
Cool. Thanks, Elliot. So Elliot, I'll be leading you through the slides, but Elliot will be here for today's conversation and to help answer any questions and of course correct me all the times I screw up and say things about markets and economies that I am clearly not qualified to be saying. But first I wanted to give you some quick background onto why I even chose to pursue this study. So as all of you are well aware, actively restoring habitats is a major element of the conservation portfolio of TNC, as well as several other conservation groups and organizations. Restoration, in its simplest definition, is manipulating habitat to increase habitat function. In fact, when I communicate the work we do to less informed audiences, I often describe it as construction projects that make fish. And increasingly, these fish-making construction projects are becoming a larger piece of the overall economy, with participants and roles within that economic value chain And we, the royal we, like those of us on this call, are major, if not the most major players in that chain. However, despite restoration being an industry of its own, we rarely think about it in that way that a private industry might. As ecologists and conservationists, we appropriately put significant effort towards lobbying for increased funding toward this type of work. But in my opinion, we traditionally have not been as strong at taking a close look at ourselves and asking if we are operating in the most efficient manner. So this is something that has always intrigued me, as well as nagged at me a bit, that we as ecological organizations have evolved into restoration businesses without ever explicitly setting out to be that. So when I learned of an opportunity offered to support an extern position with Bain, I knew it would be a good opportunity to start our understanding down this path through that lens, not viewing restoration as ecologists, but with that business lens that Elliot was referring to. So like Elliot mentioned, he's from Bain & Company, a global management consulting service that primarily works with Fortune 500 companies. The firm advises on issues such as private equity investments, mergers and acquisitions, corporate strategy, finance, operations, and market analysis. For several years, Bain has had a global partnership with TNC to explore areas where Bain services can support our conservation work. And that partnership represents about tens of millions of dollars in in-kind support. And that's the partnership we use to conduct this study. So I decided to use oysters as our case study. It's my sense that many of Elliot's findings apply to restoration of several, if not all, habitat types. But I chose oysters because it's a habitat that has received significant funding attention. And TNC, as several of you probably know, are implementing projects at significant scales. I explicitly told Elliot I did not want a review of the quote unquote success of oyster restoration projects or techniques. We have that expertise and all of you already. Instead, I specifically wanted Elliot to do for us what he does for large multi-million-dollar companies and organizations like he was just mentioning, to assess the oyster restoration industry as an industry and examine where efficiencies and improvements can be found. So we first set out to understand things like how big even is this economy? What does it compare to? Who's involved? How does it vary by region? Those kinds of questions. Then taking that business lens, we dove into what should we be doing differently to make our work more efficient and increasing our chances of actually meeting the daunting restoration challenges we have ahead. The highlights we'll give you today don't really do justice to the sheer enormity of the project that Elliot took on in just a few short months. But I think you'll see in this short presentation that Elliot's already shed light on some really important solutions we should be keeping our eye on as we advance restoration in the US. So I'll start by sharing our main goals for the work. The first one is we wanted to conduct that market assessment of the oyster reef restoration industry in the US in a similar manner to how Bain does it for a variety of industries and companies. And second, we wanted to evaluate current practices within the industry from a business lens to identify how it can scale. By business lens, we mean the non-technical elements of how restoration projects run, which in this context is trying to improve what can be thought of as large-scale construction projects. So how do we go about doing this? Mostly through interviews, a lot of them. So here's our interview summary. Overall, we spoke to 68 people across TNC, other NGOs, state resource agencies, engineering firms, construction firms, hatcheries, material suppliers, government funders and regulators, and academics. While interviews were our main focus of net new information, hence conducting over 68 hours of them, we also collected project budget information, did an extensive review of available oyster restoration project data sets from NOAA's Restoration Center, Deepwater Horizon oil spill funded work, and 3 academic data sets, as well as existing literature on oyster reef restoration. So I'll jump into the market assessment findings first. So before sharing the numbers, I'll quickly define what we mean by market size. So a market or an industry size refers to the annual spend within that industry. For this analysis, we actually used 5 years of data from 2016 to 2021 to estimate the average annual spend today. We can talk later in the questions and discussion as to why we used 5 years, but it has to do with the life cycle of projects and also the interruptions that COVID was presenting when we did the study. For oyster reef restoration, this is the spend on every element of a project that directly restores oyster reefs, as well as the associated work such as planning efforts, academic and private research, surveys of various kinds, etc. Also, we're just talking about the oyster restoration market. So this includes intertidal, subtidal habitat reef, as well as living shorelines, where the dominant structure was meant to be oyster. It does not include projects with the intention of replenishing oyster populations with the direct purpose of harvesting them or aquaculture. But outside that, we let the interviewees decide and determine what was being dictated as an oyster restoration project. It should be noted that, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first and only work done to determine the size of the oyster reef restoration economy nationally. So we estimate the overall oyster reef restoration market in the US to be about $70 to $90 million per year, with 60 to 70 million of that going to in-water projects, shown with the dark blue to the left. And just as a note, reminder, our last year was 2021, so this isn't capturing like IRA and BIL funding, which I'll talk about in a minute. To reach this estimate, we looked to the 5 years of data, so again, 2016 to 21, and then we took annual averages. This means our restoration market is about 1/3 the size of each of the US oyster aquaculture markets and US wild harvest oyster markets. Or to put it another way, the oyster reef restoration market is about the same size as Amazon's revenue when it went public in 1997. The 2 charts to the right provide the regional and state breakdowns of the darker blue bars on the left, that's 60 to 70 million. We first tried to use various data sets to get to this figure, but they just weren't comprehensive, and we discussed that more in our recently published paper. But ultimately, we had to take a different approach, so we went state by state and spoke to leading organizations in every coastal state to build the market sizes from the bottom up. And as you can see, the Mid-Atlantic, mostly the Chesapeake Bay, and the Gulf of Mexico, mostly via Deepwater Horizon oil spill funding, are the most active regions. The West Coast only represents about 2% of the market. We can also split in-water spend across the oyster reef restoration value chain to understand where these dollars actually go. The graph on the right is the typical value chain from planning at the bottom through to monitoring at the top. As you can see, construction and materials represent the largest cost of a typical project. Planning, permitting, and design are smaller portions, but these costs are often more fixed per project versus per acre. Then, using the market size, we can estimate both the number of jobs supported by the oyster reef restoration industry as well as the total economic impact. To do this, we leveraged earlier work by Todd Bendor from the University of North Carolina. And if we take the midpoint of our market size range, that 80 million of direct output per year, we can estimate that oyster reef restoration in the US directly supports about 1,500 jobs. But in economics, we also add indirect and induced output, or how those direct dollars and jobs trickle down to the coastal, often rural communities where restoration occurs. This brings the total economic output to $210 million and total jobs supported to between 2,000 and 5,000 due to the oyster reef restoration industry. So growth projections are another standard piece of market assessments. However, oyster reef restoration isn't driver-based like other industries Elliot has studied. So instead, we asked all of our interviewees their expectations regarding the amount of oyster reef restoration 5 years from now versus today or at the time of the study. They nearly unanimously expected it to increase. And this table summarizes the reasoning and ranks their relative impact, clearly pointing to a positive growth outlook at the time. Two of the top growth factors that people said were increased federal and state funding. And again, remember that the last year was 2021, so it was right before BIL and IRA funding was about to kind of hit the street, so to speak. And the growing prevalence of living shorelines was the second factor that interviewees mentioned. We then also wanted to get a sense of regional differences. So we developed this maturity index to visualize where each state sits relative to each other. This is in no way meant to be some kind of scoring system or ranking of success, but instead, we were just trying to come up with a way to visualize the relative differences based on 5 combined factors. The 5 factors we weighted included total spend per acre, state involvement in projects, ease of permitting, and the restored reef's protection status. The purpose of this was to show what stage each state is at and to guide their next steps, since that will be very different for each state. Given the somewhat non-rigorous nature of this analysis, we did not include this in the recent market analysis publication that came out last month, so you won't see this in that publication. So that's the summary of our market assessment, which was foundational to the project, but maybe slightly less exciting. I'll move on to the second set of the key findings around the performance improvement, which was the portion of the study that we found particularly interesting and was really the what drove the concept of the project. So before diving into what we can do, I want to make the quick case for why we must improve current practices. So to give an example of the need, Pensacola Bay has a near-term restoration goal of about 1,400 acres, as developed by a large local stakeholder group, which you guys are familiar with. If we wanted to focus all of our national efforts on just Pensacola Bay, it would take dedicating 4 full years. To focus just all of our Gulf of Mexico efforts, it would take 14 years. And to focus just all of our Florida efforts, it would take 20 years. So we, of course, want to do better. We want to move faster. We want our dollars to go further. So from our interviews, we collected over 175 ideas to improve performance, and then we refined them down into actionable recommendations, and that's the focus of the next section. So here's the list of our 6 key performance improvement opportunities for a project boiled down from those 175 ideas. I'll walk through some of them with you. The first one that you can see here is just leveraging economies of scale. So the first opportunity, like I said, is to reduce costs, or to reduce costs is to leverage economies of scale. So by making our projects larger, we can make each acre significantly cheaper. While this makes intuitive sense, we wanted to investigate exactly where and how much the savings could be. So this chart shows an example of a 1-acre project that costs 100% per acre. And by doing 5 acres instead, each acre is 30% cheaper by saving significantly on planning and permitting, and some each on design, materials, construction, and monitoring. We created and refined this chart using project budget data we collected from project managers and through all of our interviews. For example, we looked at contract bidding data, compared project budgets of various sizes in close proximity, and also simply asked project managers how much more a given step would cost if, say, 5 times the size. And often they'd say, well, not much more, it would take roughly the same amount of work. I'll give an example input for how we reach the materials and construction savings estimates, just as an example. Here's a real-life living shoreline project in the Gulf of Mexico, where each of the 5 bidders on the x-axis expected to charge an average of about 20% less for the second half mile versus the first. This contract included labor, equipment, and materials. Seeing these bid differentials with the materials included was particularly interesting because we didn't actually expect as significant a savings just by doubling the materials. We took the same real-life proof point approach for each stage of the restoration value chain to calculate that 30% total savings figure I showed you on the last slide. So here's that same list again of the 6 key performance improvement opportunities, boiled down from those 175 ideas. We just took a look at economies of scale, and now I'll look into a few of the others. Beyond economies of scale, the remaining 5 tactical cost reduction opportunities collectively could be worth another 30% in savings for an average national project. As examples, I'll dive into insourcing and training and contractor involvement. If we start, excuse me, with the benefits of insourcing engineering, we can look to an analogous national scale restoration NGO who reported they have historically staffed in-house engineering teams for their work, and they estimate saving 25 to 50% on engineering costs due to this. We also spoke with other oyster restoration organizations who previously had engineers on staff, and they stated in many ways the engineer more than paid for themselves by lowering the cost of restoration projects. Next, contractors are rarely involved in a project until designs are finalized, permits are approved, and funding is secured. However, contractors interviewed claimed they could reduce materials and construction costs by anywhere from 5 to 25% through earlier involvement by simplifying designs and suggesting cheaper alternatives. For example, using 2 sizes of rock was mentioned as a potentially very expensive decision from an implementation standpoint, since it really slows construction down. One interesting side note here is that large-scale government projects are increasingly using similar strategies for their contracts in an effort to let contractors be more cost-efficient with their designs. The design build replaces the traditional method of awarding separate contracts for their design and construction. The contractor, designers, subcontractors, and owners all work together as one team to build a project that meets or exceeds the owner's expectations. Looking to the business world, the best companies are often more vertically integrated. So if we're trying to run the most efficient oyster reef restoration operation, we also should look to hire more of the required skill sets in-house, or at least dedicate the resources to involve them earlier when we can't insource them directly. Commercial collaboration is another tactical but sometimes overlooked cost reduction opportunity that could lead to relatively easy savings. Easy in quotes, by the way. Excuse me. So commercial collaboration essentially means leveraging shared resources, and this can be achieved in a variety of ways. For example, an obvious opportunity is collaborating with state-led wild reef culching because it requires many of the same resources as restoration. There's a subset of state agencies that engage in culching, but do not lead to oyster restoration in the way that we're defining it here, leaving restoration organizations to use separate resources but similar techniques. By coordinating and sharing resources between commercial and restoration interests, restoration projects can benefit from the commercial scale. The Virginia Marine Resource Commission is a strong example here, where they manage both the commercial culching as well as partnering in the Chesapeake Bay oyster reef restoration efforts. VMRC's restoration costs are the lowest of any organization that we studied. They cited specifically ensuring to line up projects so they smoothly transition the contractors and equipment between restoration and commercial work and avoid unnecessary mobilization and demobilization costs. There are other ways too to leverage and collaborate with commercial efforts, even in places where states aren't culching, such as involving commercial labor or sharing other common resources from nearby projects. To put this all back into context, let's imagine a concerted restoration effort in Pensacola Bay that dedicates about $10 million per year to oyster restoration efforts. Using status quo approaches and costs, it would take 14 years to restore to 50% of the near-term goal, shown as the gray diagonal line on the right. Layering in just the cost reduction approaches would reduce this to 10 years. And then finally, by adding in the power of economies of scale, we can reach this target in just under 7 years and reach the 100% goal in under 14 years, shown as the green diagonal line to the left. So those cost reduction opportunities we just reviewed were all about how we can reduce costs on any single project. But we also want to make advancements to support scaling of the industry more broadly. By that, we mean things we can do across the entire industry. Funders, practitioners, regulators, all of us, to increase the pace and scale of restoration output as we improve the industry as a whole. So from interviews, we also synthesized the key advancements required for the industry to grow efficiently. Those included the list that you see here. So things like consistent restoration funding, because currently the intermittent funding structure, based largely on grants, adds additional unnecessary costs to projects. Statewide oyster planning to support the conception of statewide oyster restoration planning, so we can first designate areas for restoration, then prioritize those areas. Permitting simplification and better efficiencies in that process. Alternative and innovative substrates, not necessarily appropriate to the Gulf, but this was a national study, so things like restoration earmarked, hatchery capacity, integration with state and commercial fisheries enhancement, which I also mentioned partially in the last section, and multi-year monitoring of sites. And we discuss each of these in more detail in the white paper that Katie was referring to. So that's it for the core presentation. Again, this is just some of the highlights. So if you're interested in learning more, like Katie mentioned, we've published the first part, the market analysis part, in a recent paper in ecological restoration. And I think Katie sent that out. One of these days, if I ever get around to it, I hope to find the time to write up the performance improvement concepts into a publication as well. But in the meantime, I think Katie shared the white paper with you where you can get into these in more detail. But in conclusion, the key takeaways are that the oyster reef restoration industry is a substantial industry with an estimated 80 million of direct annual spend, generating over 200 million of economic output, but is very regionally concentrated. And second, our current pace of restoration is insufficient to achieve our goals in a reasonable time frame. But we know that by optimizing how we run projects, there is potential to reduce restoration costs by nearly 50%. And by supporting specific advancements, we can allow restoration to scale more efficiently. So yeah, with that, we can take some questions if y'all have any, but that's it for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Bryan and Elliot, for being here today. That was a great presentation. Are there questions from the group?
This is Anne. Thank you. The more I hear this, the more I'm absorbing it and understanding it, and it was very, very clearly laid out. Thank you, Bryan and Elliot. I just have a question for Elliot, not related specifically to this, but do you see applications for this type of work for other types of habitat restoration, and are you pursuing that maybe with the Nature Conservancy or others?
Hey, Anne. I remember we chatted a lot working on this project, so thank you for your help here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I certainly do. I think likely there are many other habitats that have, the way I describe it to other people, I guess, would be like the oyster economy has grown somewhat like organically. Like I imagine 50 years ago, there was a few groups doing a little bit of restoration here and there. As we've realized the importance to oysters to like the economy as well as the biodiversity of oceans and all the other benefits with shoreline protection, etc. But this has become more of an economy. And I think because it's not a formal commercial economy, there isn't like one business that does this for profit and like is given $100 million by NOAA or something. So I think for any other habitat, there's a very similar case to be made where, although it's great that there's lots of usually smaller organizations doing the restoration, I think like coordinating and especially pooling the money into fewer larger projects is like a very quick thing. Not easy, but like a on the surface quick thing that would make projects much more efficient. And also like if this was coordinated statewide with the culching efforts, as Bryan was mentioning. We haven't done other work in other habitats, like specifically. I think the first interesting step in my mind would be like sharing this work to other habitat groups and saying like, does this sound like it would be applicable? And then like what nuances could be different would be an interesting presentation.
Thank you. Daniel has his hand up, Katie.
Yeah, thanks.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Thank you. This was a really interesting presentation, and thank you. The value proposition was really interesting, and so I didn't hear it directly, but I kind of want to just clarify the indirect multiplier. Did that also factor in like volunteer efforts and those kinds of in-kind support values?
So we did not include any of the volunteer in-kind dollars. Well, no volunteer hours were included in the dollar figure, where there was sometimes in-kind support in a project that like can be quantified. Like if an engineering firm gave something pro bono and it was worth $200,000, that would be included. But volunteer hours we decided, and this was a debate with Bryan and I back in a few years ago in March, whether we do include that. I think that would be an on top value. But in terms of the one slide we presented of like the economy is, let's say, $70 to $90 million, and then to multiply that as you do in economics, like there's the trickle down impact. So if there's $80 million being spent, that means that there's actually a much larger economic impact based on that multiplier. And that multiplier doesn't exist for volunteering. Like there isn't a volunteer being given money who then goes to a grocery store and a restaurant and pays rent and then the landlord and the restaurant owner like pay to someone else. Like that's the trickle down, which doesn't happen for volunteering. So we decided to not include that in the dollar figure, but it certainly would be an on-top value that makes this economy larger.
Thank you.
I have another one if nobody else does. And I may have missed this in the presentation, so apologies if I did, but let's take the NOAA IIJA funding, for instance, for restoration and get economies of scale for spending the money. You know, we could look across multiple projects of various different entities, not the same entity doing a large scale project, and maybe across a region or a state. And is there possibility of getting economies of scale where there's X number of, let's say, reef restoration projects that are all needing similar type materials? And can we work across that level of economy of scale? And it requires integration with the funding entity, obviously, and a little bit more complexity. But in the end, could we get the economies of scale that way? And so it's not a question so much as a comment, I guess, but we do have funding agencies on the phone. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the kind of thought processes I think that we need to start pursuing. It's, as everybody here knows, though, it's complicated, not because people don't see the rationale and the value, but because we're often locked into this kind of like governmental structure. And not pointing the finger. I mean, I would suggest that our government colleagues and friends on the phone probably struggle. I used to work for the government, by the way. They probably struggle with this more than we do. But just as an anecdote, I'm currently working on a project now to try to fund, and literally it's two different funding sources that we're trying to pull together. And everybody understands, funders, us, everyone understands that if we go to bid at the same time, we literally save millions of dollars. But because of just the sheer timing of the funding A versus funding B, and they're both government fundings, but they're coming through two different streams of funding. Same agency, by the way, just like different pots, if you will. We're probably going to miss that opportunity because of that. I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, what the word would be, kind of red tape's not the right word, but like just the process. And so there is, you know, in my opinion, there's this element of like the kind of infrastructure, if you will, of how we fund this work. And by that, I mean the infrastructure of like how we move money from A to B to C and how we're allowed to implement it, the procurement rules that we have to follow. It doesn't align with us actually being able to achieve restoration at the highest efficiency, which is unfortunate given kind of the ecological kind of crisis that we're in.
Yeah, I get that. I'm wondering, so I'm, you know, most familiar with Pensacola, and right now the estuary program there has selected a firm and will negotiate. And as we proceed down that line of restoring 600 hectares over the next 10 years, I think we have the opportunity to work with the funding agencies and entities who are receiving funding to try to see if we can align certain aspects of what we're trying to achieve over 10 years with other projects. And it requires just keeping an eye out and working with the funding agencies to understand who else is doing the work and what their timeline is, and seeing if we can synchronize at least some of that. You know, when you have a longer timeline like 10 years, it's probably possible to do that. Then you got to get it done in 2 years or 3 years, you know. So something to think about.
Yep. And that
And-
also relates to what we mentioned in the second set of talking points about one of the unfortunate realities is the stochastic nature of funding limits our ability to kind of do that forward thinking to be more efficient. And that you could apply that at kind of like all levels, right? It could be like, oh, TNC would love to hire an engineer for the next 10 years because we know on paper we could save blah, blah, blah. But unless we can show the money to support that position for the next 10 years, we're not going to get approval to hire that position. And you could just keep applying that same problem point all the way up the kind of chain, right?
Yeah, it's
From-
kind of a catch-22.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Brian and Elliot. Maybe another catch-22. I think you reported that in terms of the distribution of spending, 10% goes to monitoring. When you did your interviews, did you ask respondents to kind of time bound their response with respect to monitoring? And the reason I ask is, related to funding, different sources of funding require different amounts of monitoring. Different agencies maybe have a well-established program while smaller groups don't. And so I'm wondering how that 10% value was determined.
That was based on what the project decided they thought was necessary, or what the funders funding the project decided was necessary. So it wasn't, we only including the first 3 years of your monitoring your budget. It's like we look at their entire budget, and if for whatever reason they have 1 year of monitoring or 10 years of monitoring, that was the figure included to then find the average of 10%. What we did find generally is like every project is somewhat cash strapped, and putting more dollars toward doing an extra acre, people might prioritize over an extra few years of monitoring, especially if like the funding source is not going to keep giving them money for 5 years. They might allocate the money differently, but that does make it difficult to then look back on the project if the monitoring isn't long enough. So we didn't capture, the number of years of monitoring would vary by project, but I think a general takeaway we had that Bryan mentioned was longer monitoring cycles and compiling that data together would help to make projects more effective.
Thank you. I'll ask just one more question. 33% of cost goes to raw materials, and alternative and innovative substrates were kind of one of the things highlighted in this work. I think there's quite a high potential that many of us are thinking through, like the environmental costs of some of these choices, some of these alternatives, based on transportation costs, depending on where they're located, et cetera. So how much of that would you say has come up? Did you notice any themes in the interviews with respect to alternative substrates?
It seemed like, there's a few interesting points, and Bryan, feel free to add on. One we had heard from a few groups was, instead of purchasing new substrate, like using the cleaned aggregate from a demolished bridge or something under the Infrastructure Act, I think what we certainly did hear quite a bit of, and a reason that economies of scale helps, is lots of substrates being trucked or shipped in trains or in barges like across the country. So finding local sources, and the hitting like the balance of, well, we're restoring this habitat, but we're pumping a bunch of CO2 in the air to get oyster shell from the northeast to the southwest, can be a tricky piece. We did speak to a few groups, I think Bryan reminded me, mostly on like the northeast, who were trying different substrates for shoreline protection, but they were not at scale. So I think it'd be an interesting thing for TNC or other groups to look into, like, would it be worth it to partner more concretely with some of these substrate like innovations and see if that's like a path to go forward with, because there were some interesting things that they were building, but very, very small scale.
I mean, I think Katie, in a kind of a different, taking that point, that conversation point, kind of slightly different angle is like, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, regardless of what substrate you're talking about. What we, again, the royal we are really bad at doing is being like, we never stop and say, if I was building the next Hilton hotel and I operated in the manner I do and I spend the money, I would not be a project manager for Hilton very long, right? Because we're not held to the same standards of like bottom line, but we should be because we're trying to do the most ecological restoration possible with $1, but we're not held to those standards. So the first thing that comes to my mind is, why are we shipping material across the country every time we do a project? Why do we not have 2 or 3 centralized staging areas for material, ship that stuff across the country one time, and then it doesn't need to go? So now we've reduced our costs, we've improved our efficiencies, and lowered our carbon footprint. But again, we never are held to those standards to think like that. And so that goes back to my original thing, is like, we've all evolved into restoration businesses, but we were never meant to be restoration businesses. So I think those of us on this call, our job is to start putting that pressure on ourselves a little bit. And if we run into those kind of logistical hurdles, our funders, for example, they're not going to know to solve those until we bring them to them, Maybe if we bring, hey, can we do this procurement rule a little bit different? Maybe there's scope in there. Maybe there's something that can be changed. But until we start thinking of those types of solutions, it's never going to change.
Yeah, good points, Bryan. Thank you.
Do you see an opportunity for, looking at clean materials from demolition projects and pairing and synchronizing those with restoration projects if the material is of appropriate, type of material? Obviously, there's billions of dollars on each side being spent, billions for demolition, billions for restoration. Do you see an opportunity for trying to coordinate and synchronize those?
The sidebar to this, which this study did not get into, right, is like the biological implications, right? Like, is it good for oysters? Is it good for the environment, right? So like, that's not what we got into. But assuming like you've looked into those kind of oyster related, and there's, yes, I think that is definitely, I don't just work in the Gulf of Mexico. I work in every coastal state. And one thing that I can assure you is the most common theme in every state, Oregon, Washington, to Rhode Island, to Florida, is this substrate limitation. So we absolutely have to deal with it. So somebody needs to like investigate both from it is obviously being investigated from like the biological side, right? Like, do oysters like it? Is it clean? Is it okay to put in the environment? But nobody's really picking up like that more like coordination approach that, as far as I know, nobody's really kind of looking at that bigger coordination approach. And I definitely think that somebody should be. I think I think it'd be appreciated by everyone in the country.
Any last questions? Comments? Thank you very much, Bryan and Elliot. It's great to see you both and have you here today. One question just came in the chat. Vincent, has there been movement from funders to require grant applicants to include economic optimization in their proposals? And is there potential there?
That's a great question. I don't know. Do we have any funders on the call that can answer that?
I had to step away for a minute. Could you repeat that question?
Hey, Chris. Yeah, the question was, has there been any movement from funders to require grant applicants to include economic optimization in their proposal or justification for, I guess, various methodologies with respect to costs?
So the way the Restoration Center does it in our current funding opportunities, or our most recent, is you'll see in the evaluation criteria that your application will be scored with an eye to cost effectiveness. Now, we don't have a specification for reviewers how to exactly evaluate for cost effectiveness. It's kind of on your own professional judgment. Another space where we kind of get at that is sustainability in terms of both the ecological and the economic sustainability, so O&M type things. So we don't explicitly discuss optimization, but we do consider cost effectiveness when we're selecting projects.
Thank you, Chris.
I'll echo what Chris just said. We have kind of the same thing in our RFPs. The reviewers have scoring criteria for those same things.
I would be curious to understand. So one big thing is there's lots of different groups doing oyster restoration. And if you're in the same, like this is all Florida, if you're in the same geography, probably the same funders, like you could have two groups in adjacent bays or the same bay with one funder. I'm curious from a funding perspective, do you ever look at projects together and say, hey, or the same substrate, or maybe you could use the same substrate if you coordinated, we're giving you each $1 million. Could you coordinate your effort to bring the substrate and get one barge? Like, I guess it's in my mind, without like some overall governing body, it would be the funders that would have the best view into which projects are going on simultaneously between different groups.
I will say I saw that much more often in a previous position with the state, where utilities started to really plan from an integrative perspective. So dig once, the concept of digging once for utilities, for stormwater, for flood control, for wetland restoration project. So they have gotten to a point where they've become more integrated and collaborative on the cost savings of digging only once and coordinating across entities. But in terms of large scale marine restoration, we just haven't gotten to the point where we have, I think until these most recent funding opportunities, have been funding multiple entities or multiple projects at the exact same time to have that opportunity of scale. So this is new. So I think people's eyes are more towards it now in terms of National Fish and Wildlife Foundation working in the same geographies at the same time as NOAA's Restoration Center. Like now we're going to come up on those opportunities and we have to start thinking strategically kind of on the spot. So it's an emerging opportunity that I think we're all very busy, but that maybe this kind of work and your kind of messaging will help us prioritize. And sorry for the road noise.
That's great. That's really helpful, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Go ahead, Dan.
I'll just add that Chris is dead on, with the additional funding. And it's funny because we actually put in a proposal from the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program to NOAA, have a transformational habitat with over 15 partners. And so we actually did that. So if there was an in water restoration happening in one area and also happening in another, because we had like 20 different sites, we did that cost savings and we noted it in our budget. So that's already being discussed. And like Chris said, I think that these big, large fundings are helping that process move forward.
Yeah, that's cool.
Hopefully NOAA takes positive to that and we get funded.
Thanks, Dan. All right, let's close the recording there.